The world of mixed media today is filled with resources that support the existence of paranormal phenomenon. But in my opinion, the evidence presented by the investigators on these shows doesn't go far enough in probing the events they've captured. I'm always left scratching my head, dealing with unanswered questions. In this series, I'm going to take a deeper and critical look at paranormal phenomenon and try to get some real answers.
Hi guys, Shady Dave here, and today I'd like to talk to you about electronic voice phenomenon, or EVP for short. I have in my possession an audio file that contains an EVP experience. I made this recording a couple of nights ago in my basement office, and I was completely isolated and alone at the time of the experience. The sounds and suggested dialogue are pretty creepy, but I cleaned up the audio as best as I could to make the otherworldly messages as clear as possible. But first, let's start with an introduction to EVP and the spiritualism movement of the late 19th century.
Between the 1840s and the 1920s, the spiritualism movement was starting to take hold. There were fantastic new inventions happening every day, as seemingly all of humankind was on the brink of scientific discovery and technological advancement. New fundamental laws of physics were beginning to take shape, and engineers were capitalizing on the newfound wealth of information by starting to construct what must have seemed to the common laypeople of the time an ever more increasingly complex and magical set of gadgets. So popular was the magical thinking of that era that even Scientific American asked Thomas Edison in an interview if his devices could be used to contact the spirit world. Not only did this show an astounding lack of understanding for the physical world, but also demonstrated a complete fail in the basic understanding of how Edison's magic trinkets actually worked. He replied that if spirits were only capable of subtle influences, a sensitive recording device would provide a better chance of spirit communication than the table-tipping and Ouija boards of mediums employed at the time. However, there is no indication that Edison ever designed or constructed a device for such a purpose. Let's skip ahead a half a century, when electric audio tape recording devices were starting to be made affordable and available to the general public. People started experimenting with different sounds and sound effects for production recording, audio manipulations that would drastically change the output of the playback device. Notably, playing records in reverse, over-amplifying ambient background tracks, repeating noises over and over in a loop. A lot of people swore they could hear recognizable words in their processed recordings, and would often make the leap to spiritualism explanations that pervaded the collective consciousness a half a century before. These aberrant audio samples became known to the mediums and New Age spiritualists as
electronic voice phenomenon,
and could consist of single words, full phrases, screams, scratches, and anything else creepy and, at face value, otherwise unexplainable. I'm going to take a critical look at the tape to see if there is any truth to this experience. How powerful are the emotions involved, and how do they shape the way we perceive paranormal events?
I started the process by basically taking the audio file that I'd generated during the EVP session, and I looked at the spectral analysis of the sound waves, the little bit on the bottom there that's kind of orangey, to see if there are any kind of recognizable speech patterns in the silent parts. The silent parts show up as the gaps. That's when I'm not speaking. I guess I was kind of nervous, so I was talking a lot. It's about a 6-minute recording, but I did manage to capture something, which is actually pretty interesting. It kind of made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up when I heard it. If you look at the second large gap, the background audio appears to change just a little bit. I don't know, it looks kind of like some lines or whatever up top, so I took that one section, since it seemed to be a little different than the rest, and pulled it out to see if I could have anything come out of it. I'm using Adobe Sound Booth to do the audio processing in this. So right away, when we look at that piece of audio all blown up and isolated, we can see a number of characteristics here. We have some horizontal bands going right through it. Those are just constant frequencies, like the overhead fluorescent lights. There's a water pump going in the background, and there's also the sound of the water rushing through the pipes. It's kind of an old house, so you can hear this kind of stuff. So what I did was I isolated each one of those horizontal bands. Actually, you're able to capture that as a sound print, and then just delete the bands. Here are a couple of audio samples of what those bands sound like when they're isolated alone. And then I went through the spectrograph again, and I looked for any vertical bands. Now, vertical bands are pretty good indications of sharp sounds or syllables in speech. So it's actually pretty handy to have this view because you can see immediately there are a bunch of really, really faint vertical bands, but they are there. Now, as I said, I couldn't hear anything aside from the pump or anything. So when you go through the audio and you strip it all out, you're left with something that looks almost completely blank. But you can see that there are a couple of anomalies that actually sort of jump out from the background noise when you remove all of the background noise. It actually kind of struck me as bizarre when you zoom in on these little fragments of sound that are left over from the sound filter. They almost look like people. It looks like a big sea of people. It's kind of disconcerting. So if you go through and just pump up the amplitude of all of those remaining sound fragments, you can see that there's still a little bit of noise left, but there's not nearly the horizontal rumble that we were having before. And it looks like up top, if you look at the histogram, what that shows is the amplitude of the sound wave. It looks a lot like dialogue, which again is kind of freaky. I was able to isolate a couple of portions of it, and I'm going to play them for you now. What it sounds like they're saying, we'll figure that out.
And therefore ghosts exist. Case closed. Nah, I'm just kidding. That's where cable TV would leave it off, with absolutely no benefit to the end viewer. Although the sound anomalies on this recording are peculiar, they aren't outside the realm of rational explanation. I was alone in the basement at the time of the recording, but my mother-in-law was upstairs watching Wheel of Fortune. Now, I personally couldn't hear anything above the low rumble of the water pump down here, but my iPad's tiny microphone, as low-powered as it is, could pick up almost everything in the house. I mean, it required me jacking the background noise up to an unreasonable level, and I applied some heavy-duty filters to the end audio file, but in the end, I was able to pick out the audience cheering, perhaps some lady named Rachel introducing herself, and Pat Sajak mumbling and talking about the rules of the game. Just throwing that out there. Now, what does it say about the thinking process of individuals who swear that they heard a message from beyond? Unfortunately, we all fall victim to these minor errors in judgment. Our brains are wired to constantly look for recognizable patterns. This is a process called pareidolia. This is how we can carry on a conversation with a person in a crowded room, or why we're likely to see faces in random symmetrical patterns. Without this inborn talent, it would become computationally very difficult to discern your friend's voice and face from the background din of the room. So this automated psychological process is necessary. It's the emotional attachment that we get to the perception of these errors that destroys our common sense. Confirmation bias is a powerful thing. You listen to the audio over and over again and try to glean some meaning from what could just be a random assortment of sounds and syllables. Most other people may not hear what you do right away, but if you prime them and tell them what to expect, you can convince almost anyone that this is what you're hearing. Don't get me wrong, all EVP recordings may not fall under this explanation. There are a lot of recordings out there. Conversely, there are also a lot of people hoping to get famous by manufacturing false recordings. If you ever get the chance to examine one of these recordings firsthand, just keep your head about you and try to eliminate all of the natural variables before you jump to the supernatural conclusions.